Revered and respected by our ancestors for thousands of years, demonized and suppressed by the war on drugs, and now at the dawn of a new millennia, they are making their triumphant return. Scientists, researchers, and patients alike are exploring these ancient therapies to heal modern ailments. And we're here to bring you the latest in scientific research, cutting-edge practices, and first-hand experiences from those who have been transformed in body, mind, and spirit by plant medicines from cannabis to psilocybin to ayahuasca and beyond. This is the Plant Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Plant Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey, and today we're going to be discussing psychedelics and communities of color with Ifetayo Harvey and Mary Sanders. Ifetayo Harvey is a writer, advocate, and speaker. She is the founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective platform, which she founded for folks of color to learn about and create community around psychedelics. Mary Sanders is a licensed clinical social worker whose focus is on addressing trauma in communities of color and marginalized populations. She has worked with Black, Indigenous, veterans, immigrants and refugees from Iraq and Syria, foster youth, and LGBTQIA Two-Spirit community members. She is a trained psychedelic-assisted therapist from CIIS and MAPS, certified in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and is currently enrolled at the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute. Mary is also a founding board member at the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. I certainly hope you all enjoyed this episode as much as I did because, as you know, we don't generally have two people on, so it was lovely to have this kind of communal feeling, and we're all discussing these topics, and you can hear each of the guests supporting each other. And not only do they share their lived experiences and some experiences of their clients and other people in their collective, but they also remind us that the drug war has actually been a war on communities of color. And as we're going forward with medicalization or legalization or decriminalization, that we need to keep in mind ways to ensure access to these life-changing medicines for the populations that have been suffering under this drug war for so long. Now, before we get started, just a reminder that the Plant Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. Now, without further ado, thank you so much for joining me, Ifetayo and Mary.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. There's a lot of topics to cover, and I love that we've got both of you here with us, coming from two different areas. Mary from the therapy area, and Ifetayo more from I think you founded the POC Psychedelic Collective, and so I'm really interested to hear both perspectives. Ifetayo, would you start for us and talk about some unique needs that communities of color face that are not necessarily addressed in a lot of psychedelic ceremonies or integration circles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I came into my work around psychedelics from a drug policy reform perspective, um, dealing with some of my own lived experiences around the war on drugs, and I think that when it comes to psychedelic spaces, whether it be integration circle or a ceremony, I think that a lot of the spaces aren't necessarily equipped to deal with issues around racism and racial trauma. I've heard from a lot of people that some racial trauma has come up for them, while they're on a trip, and the folks around them didn't really know how to respond, or, um, you know, in some ceremonies, they're playing music from Southeast Asia, not really knowing the particular context of that music or the cultural background of that music. So I think, particular needs is we need trauma informed, culturally competent facilitators and healers. And, we also require a different level of healing, I think. Not to pathologize us, but, you know, looking at the history of this country and the world, Black people especially have, endured centuries of trauma. um, through enslavement, Jim Crow.
Mhm.
Today we're dealing with mass incarceration, the drug war, police killings, and so being informed and understanding those topics and understanding that, okay, you may be in a room with 10, 20 people, and some of these folks are more than likely directly impacted by these issues. A lot of us, had family members in prison, or if, have been to prison ourselves or to jail, or been harassed by cops or arrested for drug use. And so it's a different level of trauma, or a different type of trauma, I should say. Um, so yeah, I'll stop there.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Mary?
Yeah, thank you, Ife. That was so beautiful. I do think that there's such an importance for healers to be represented in these spaces, and so so important to have BIPOC representation, two-spirit LGBTQ representation, and that in itself, right? It's seeing other people that look like you, come from the similar ancestral trauma. That in itself helps support a sense of safety. I know that when I've stepped in a space, a ceremonial space, and didn't see a person like me, I already had some defense mechanisms and just was ready, not so ready to really dip in, but really attentive to how people were circulating and communicating so that I could identify my own little bubble of safety. And some of our unique needs, like what Ife mentioned, is really being able to dive deeper and knowing that that person can hold that kind of space. And so that does take, either this lived experience, this training, but really a true understanding of the layers of trauma that we've experienced.
I appreciate you both sharing that. And Mary, what you said harken back to, I just recorded with Dr. Angela Carter, and she's a trans physician, and they were speaking today about when they go into an integration ceremony and they have to start by explaining themselves if there's nobody else
Mm.
trans in that ceremony. And I think that's akin to, I believe what you're suggesting is like you have a lived experience of a certain type of trauma, and if nobody else in that circle has that lived experience, it's hard to start by explaining your own existence and what you've been through, and then trying to explain what happened in the psychedelic ceremony on top of that, as opposed to going in and having people who've already shared that experience understand you at a different level already.
Right. And in our culture and our lived experiences, so often, right, our experiences are dismissed, they're minimized, they're invalidated. And so, it, already taking a medicine in an invulnerable state, where, we have to be cautious. Am I going to be minimized? Are my visions going to be acknowledged and held with support, with love and care? Um, I recall myself being really thoughtful. How much do I share? Can these white folks, hold this idea that I'm thinking about my ancestors in slavery and how it connects to our current, experience in this country? And so I know for myself that I had a completely different experience being able to be held and supported in a Black medicine space.
Ifetayo, is that type of experience what led you to found the People of Color Psychedelic Collective?
Yes, I think so. I got into psychedelics when I was a senior in college. I was diagnosed with depression and struggling a lot, where I was. And after I graduated, um, I think maybe a year or so after I graduated, I started my job at MAPS as the executive assistant. And in a lot of ways, working at MAPS is cool. To a lot of people, it's probably like a one in a lifetime opportunity. And I kind of see it that way too, but at the same time, I was the only. Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Slack. Uh, I was the only non-white person. I was the only black person at the organization at the time, and I was, yeah, a little uncomfortable with that. In many different instances where race was coming up for me, or more outwardly, I always share this like anecdote in a lot of talks that I do about, there's a clinical presentation, and they were talking about the study subjects, and I think it was like 95% white. um, and this is at like a staff meeting, and someone was like, oh, well, why is it so white? And the clinicians were just like, oh, well, it just happened that way. And thankfully the person responded, was like, it didn't just happen that way. And so I kind of realized that, like, okay, this research is amazing, it's exciting, but our people aren't really being included or reached out to, right? And there could be a lot of reasons for that. um and I was also thinking of, like, the MDMA assisted psychotherapy. Like, I thought that was really exciting, but then I asked myself, like, oh, would I do that? Like, if they were to offer that to me, would I be cool with it? On one hand, I really wanted to do it, but then on the other hand, I'm like, I don't know. I was really hesitant because it I guess you could say there's like an existing paradigm of black people being, experimented on, tested on, or just that history with the medical community, psychiatry, all that stuff. So that's the kind of dynamic I got when I was like thinking about that. And so after I left MAPS, I still wanted to do psychedelic work, and I felt like no one was really talking about race directly in the psychedelic space. Like, no one was really talking about it head on. I felt like folks were kind of talking around it. Like, it was a big elephant in the room. And I wrote a piece called "Why the Psychedelic Community is So White." And it got a lot of traction. And, I realized that there was a hunger, a thirst for this in our community. Because folks would email me and say, like, oh, you're the first black person I saw on the internet writing about this, so I wanted to email you. And I get so excited when I get messages like that, because it goes to show that, there's this narrative that, like, oh, black people, folks of color, are being left out of the psychedelic renaissance or revolution or whatever, right? But we've been doing our own psychedelic revolution, renaissance, out of the limelight. It's not superficial research, but when have we ever, as a race, really had access to stuff like that? Institutions like the FDA. So yeah, I've been really lucky to meet other black folks who were in the movement early on. When I was at MAPS, I attended the Women in Entheogens conference in Cleveland, Ohio, that was put on by Kai Wingo. And she was a black woman from Cleveland, mother of three, who started her own urban farm in the middle of Cleveland, growing different types of mushrooms, giving workshops. And then that's where I also met Kalindi E., who, again, he was probably the only black person I saw online talking about psychedelics at that time. And being at that conference made me realize that they had built this community of black psychedelic folks in the Midwest, right? In Cleveland, in Detroit, not in these, trendy coastal elite hipster places like where I am in New York, or the Bay Area where Mary is. Like, this is the Midwest, And so I felt so comfortable at that conference. They welcomed me like I was their family, and so I really wanted to just make a space for us, because I think that it's a simple concept, right? Creating space, but it's something that can also be really profound because we don't have access to spaces just in general, right? Like in the US, a lot of leisurely places are, they cost money, and a lot of money, and they keep a lot of people out. And so I think the idea of just creating a space for people to learn and to also meet and connect with other people, is was really needed in the psychedelic world.
Oh, that's I really appreciate you sharing how you formed that and the discovery of these other communities that were out there. And I think you're right. A lot of us think that it's just these coastal cities that are happening, and like you said, there's a lot of things happening that are not in at the institutional level and other things. And so thank you for bringing light to that and creating yet another space that people from communities of color can go to feel safer. Mary, I wanted to ask you, as Ifetayo was describing, like going into a place and realizing there are no people of color here. I know that you specialize in working with communities of color, and what has the experience been like? Have patients shared with you the perhaps like the depth they're able to get to easier when somebody from their own community is working with them as their therapist?
Oh, absolutely. Something that we had mentioned earlier is just being able to show up and already have an understanding. And that goes to, our language, the way we speak, the way we move our bodies, our shared history, right? When we talk about the black migration, where my father came from Arkansas, and we can, when I talk to my clients, we talk about where their parents, where did they grow up. My dad was much older, and so he experienced Jim Crow in Arkansas and lived on sharecroppers land. And so with some of my clients who are younger, it might be their grandparents, right? And so so often people think that this history was many generations ago, and I have to remind my friends sometimes that, oh no, that was my father, right, that worked on cotton land and had a grew all of their own vegetables and count their pennies. And so I think that being able to connect with my clients around that, as well as folks who are, first generation, second generation immigrants, right? That we have to work twice as hard, that all eyes are on us, right? And so that when I'm in this job position, I'm working twice as hard, but I actually don't slow down, even though that I have, job security, because that thought loop is there, right? That's so integrated in how we navigate the world. I have this great job. I can't let it go. I can't let my nervous system come down. And so I know in my work, it's been really such an honor to be able to share these experiences with my client, but also be able to share that piece of myself. And so it's our conversations, connecting, and I can show myself and be open and be more open, right? Because that is part of our healing, and that's part of collective healing, is building that community, and then sharing resources of other. Here in Oakland, there's East Bay Meditation Center, and there's a really strong BIPOC circle, and so just continuing to build that community so that we do have therapy, but then we have all these other spaces that are available to continue to support that healing. As I mentioned earlier, I sit with the Black Medicine Circle, and so being able to connect, right, through potlucks and hangouts, and have that ongoing connection, so that in our healing we are together, right? Healing is relational, and it's so important for that we not only do the work in the therapy space, but that we're out and about with our friends and our family and our community members, especially our community members that have similar life experiences and histories.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. You reminded me of something that I wanted to ask about, which is how psychedelics can be helpful for both healing racial trauma, but then and I'd love for you to speak to that, but what reminded me of it is that I imagine that the medicines, as you can speak to, do their own healing, and that psychotherapy does its healing. But then, like you said, the greater community participation, that lack of the disconnect that often leads to mental health, it seems like the community can help on that additional level with those feelings of separation that may be there.
Absolutely, right. This individual therapy, right? That's a very Western and modern approach. Like we come from tribes, right? We come from being together, dancing together, singing together. And if we look at our history and what our ancestors did, was often right singing in the fields, communing on Sundays, and practicing, spiritual practices. And so part of my therapeutic practice is really encouraging folks to connect with their bodies, right? Connecting with their voices, moving their bodies, and then being in community, so that we have this opportunity to be witnessed, right? Be seen, being heard. And just like you mentioned, so often our mental health is so stigmatized, especially right if we're being invalidated around this racial trauma and being denied the experience to grieve. Of course, we're going to be more isolated. And so, in terms of like the medicine work, I see the integration so important. Of course, working together with the medicine, whatever that might be, or psychedelics, is that we have time together afterwards, right? That we come back to each other and talk about it and have these ongoing conversations. And so I just, and I, yeah, I have a real like passion for the community work. I know that folks will travel because that's right now, maybe that's what feels safe or legal. But when we come back, what do we do with that, right? However, if we're sharing mushrooms with a dear friend, we can come back to that friend and continue that conversation, or medicine circle. Um, and so, yeah, I really push the community work and really think it's just so important, because I think we really, as a society, focus a lot on individual work, and we're survivors, right? Because we work together constantly. And so I think that's something in terms of like continuing to tap into that so that we can continue to move forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Ifetayo, is that something that the People of Color Psychedelic Collective provides extra spaces for? Can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of things your organization does to foster those communities and opportunities for people of color?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So we primarily do education and community building. Obviously, things have been a bit stifled because of COVID. um, and we don't do integration circles yet, but that is a thing that we may be working on in the future. But I would say, in the past, we've done a lot of online panels lately. That's where a lot of our focus has been. Um, More recently, we put on an art show, and then we had a talk around grief and psychedelics, which I thought was really moving in a lot of ways, because we really focus on how death and grieving and loss is different for folks of color. And I think it's also important to have panelists of people of color talking about using psychedelics and death. Like, those are two like taboo topics. But it's also, educating people on, like, okay, this way that we talk about death in our society, like Mary said, individualism is one of our cultural values here in the U.S., even though it hinders us a lot of times. And I think it's important to educate folks on the fact that we had different practices, especially around grieving and death, especially during a time where we are seeing so many people die from COVID. And then before that, Mary actually moderated a conversation on harm reduction and drug use, which, in my opinion, is super duper important because overdose deaths have actually increased with COVID in the past year. And even before that, overdose was one of the leading causes of death for adults under the age of 50. So, this is overdose as is it's an issue that I've been personally affected by, and I know a lot of other folks of color have been affected by overdose death, but there's a very very strong stigma around addiction, overdose, because our communities have been harmed in so many ways by policing and bad drug policies. So I think that's those are some examples of more recent um, work that we've done. Last year we did a discussion around healing, just a general discussion on healing with psychedelics for folks of color. And I thought, we got a lot of love around that because folks are just excited to hear about, folks of color candidly discussing our experiences healing with psychedelics and also talking about our trauma, whether it be dealing with interpersonal violence or domestic violence, those kind of things, intergenerational trauma, those kind of things, and thinking through practical ways that we can mitigate some of that harm. And then lastly, I'll say that before the pandemic, we had a retreat in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That was really great. And I'll be honest, I prior to that retreat, I really didn't have any ceremony experience. Like I was a person who, just took psychedelics by myself or with a trusted sitter or with like another friend or two. But this experience with the ceremony was different in a lot of ways because, like Mary said, we were doing that integration afterwards as a group, and also just having someone there to facilitate, I think, was really helpful because things inevitably come up, right? I think one thing that came up for me in the moment was just, grieving the loss of like so many friends who have died over the past couple years. And, I think that's something that, everyone experiences, but for, a Black woman like myself, a lot of those deaths have been due to gun violence or medical illnesses. And so everything in our country is racialized. All of our experiences are racialized. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to have our own spaces. And, at the end of the retreat, we kind of did like a active listening exercise where we reflected on our trip, did a little journaling, and then partner up and, talk a little bit about, what we experienced, what we're reflecting on, and then came together as a group. And it was really interesting because a lot of us had similar things that we were thinking about, similar things that we were concerned about. A lot of themes came up around family and intergenerational trauma, that kind of thing. And before that, we also had our conference in DC at the Hotel Eaton, and it consisted of a lot of different panels, 2 days. So the first day we had more panels. The second day we had more like healing type of activities. So we did a cacao ceremony, and again, I think just something as simple as just creating a space, having some speakers, creating a space like that can be really profound because there hasn't been another psychedelic conference for folks of color in person. At least we were the first, and witnessing that, I saw so many people making connections in the room. Even after the event was over, people were sticking around talking to each other. Um, there were folks who came from a long way just to come to the conference. Like people came from Detroit, people came from Arizona. There's a woman who took a bus up from North Carolina just for one day. Uh, so seeing that type of stuff, the work kind of does itself. You just have to make um, make the space right and comfortable for everyone.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing the immense amount of work you're all doing. I'm going to come back to you for a second, and in a second after I go to Mary, but I want to ask a little bit more about education and outreach. So thank you for reminding me of that. Mary, as we're listening to Ifetayo talk about how she does this ceremony, and so many people had these shared experiences, can you talk about a little bit about what perhaps your patients or even yourself in your whatever you wish to share of your own lived experience, how psychedelics themselves have helped address racial trauma and other traumas that you may have encountered?
Yes, thank you. Great question. I yeah, I work with ayahuasca as my primary medicine and also mushrooms. And so I'll just speak a little bit about myself. And I think what why I chose these medicines is because I felt my defense mechanisms, right, were so strong, and especially in avoidance, that I was really ready to take on this experience to um, ch- make a shift to the paradigm, right, really shift these patterns, and also acknowledging that indigenous communities have been using these medicines for thousands of years, and really, our ancestors were using plants, right, before they were stripped away from us. And so in my medicine work, what has helped me is to really be able to acknowledge the transgenerational trauma that I witness, right? So things are happening, right? So often with transgenerational trauma is that that something doesn't feel right. Like it doesn't feel right in the body or what you're witnessing in your family systems. Especially when more like corporal punishments is integrated in discipline, and it doesn't feel right. And so from an intellectual standpoint, you understand where that has come from, and you understand that also these tools were used because of survival, right? But they're not applicable anymore. They're not helpful, and they actually could, right, cause a lot of harm in our development. And so I think I was able to really grieve that, really to feel that pain and suffering in my body in a way that allowed me to cry for hours, right? And also to cry among my peers, and to know that I don't have to cry in shame, and that others are crying, and others, of all different walks of life, different ages, and different life experiences, can be held, and with such well trained facilitators with many, many years of experience, in which, when you know that the facilitators have such extensive skills, you can really let yourself be and know that, oh, I can trust on you at any moment. I can turn to you, right? And that you will help me. I can call for help and someone will show up. And that even actually being, right, one of my first learnings is that I can call and someone will be there. I can call and someone will be there. And so for me, it came into really a very somatic experience, really heartfelt, a lot of tears, a lot of, right, kind of purging in different ways, tears, and um, um, through the nose, and of course through purging. And so I feel like it allowed the energy that has been stuck in my joints, right, stuck in the body. And during this time, it was really allowing myself to grieve, because I knew that my father couldn't grieve, right? I knew that my father had to survive, and that living in Jim Crow is survival at any time, right? It is to be hyper vigilant, is to cross the street when you need to use the back door, yes sir, no sir, eyes down, and to really grieve that, and to imagine, wow, that that is my father's life, and I don't have to experience that, but that's still stored in my body. And so I've spent a lot of um, my experiences, and still do, of just deep grief, and hoping that in this process, right, my DNA, right, my epigenetics will change over time, and that I can show up as a more grounded and strong healer, as a better sister, better daughter, a stronger community member. But knowing that this is really lifelong work, that, and it's going to take many of generations, and also knowing that I am in a privileged space here in Oakland, that I can, right, navigate with a lot of safety where I live right now, and I know that other people can't. And so I have a lot of islands of safety that I can work with where a lot of people can't. And so that hypervigilance, right, that nervous system is quite activated. And so I think that, having my own experiences, and then being able to really, with my clients, to acknowledge and understand that somatic experience, because it really, right, words don't resonate in these experiences. And so as I continue to work with medicines, and also I'm in a training for somatic experiencing psychotherapy, I have this really beautiful parallel process. And so when I do notice I'm hypervigilant, or there's tension, in my session, I can work with it. And I'm hoping that those will be the skills that I will be able to apply, right, when I sit with folks. But I feel like I'm an infant with this medicine work, and I'm working with a lot of teachers so that I can just continue to grow and evolve, and be of support and service to my community.
Thank you so much for sharing that, your experience, and how healing looked and felt for you, and what you felt like you were going through. And this, to me, brings up something that Ifetayo had mentioned earlier, because as we are discovering that these are helpful tools for addressing trauma, it goes back to what you had said about how there's still a distrust of studies or the medical system from all of the transgressions of the past. So, Ifitayo, if you'd like to comment on, how do you think that we can start to engender some trust so that we can bring more people of color to the healing that could be so helpful, and knowing that they have every reason to, like you said, with all the things that have happened in our medical history past, to be distrustful of the system.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that requires, um, us, meaning like a community, psychedelic community, a larger psychedelic community, to, support and uplift the practitioners and healers and community members, you know, who are out there doing the work already with communities of color who already have that trust, right? Because this isn't only a thing that we see in psychedelic spaces, but even in the nonprofit field, where you have a nonprofit that's big, has a lot of money, and wants to do work in a particular state, um, folks often say that they're parachuting in and leaving, right? So we have to, really make connections and build relationships with the folks um, in communities of color who are already doing work around psychedelics. And that takes time, right? Like, that doesn't happen overnight. I think a lot of times people are kind of in a rush to just say, like, oh, well, I have this great opportunity. Like, come on, like, let's implement it. Like, let's go. Like, here's some money. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot of time to make a plan, to implement that plan, and to also build trust and relationships with people. And I know this is not an answer that folks like to hear a lot, but because we live in a time of, like, instant gratification. So to me, I think it's really about uplifting the people who are already doing the work, and then also, you know supporting the folks who want to do the work, like providing them with resources, like education, mentorship, um, things like that will help usher in a new generation of healers, practitioners, leaders, that kind of thing. So it's not just okay. Well, we did this thing once and it went okay, but so we just left it at that. It has to be a constant improvement and intergenerational as well.
Absolutely. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and Ife just kind of touched on it, is really creating accessibility. So these programs are so expensive at this point. I when I did CPTR program, you know, that was my extra money for that year. So every dollar I spent, I had to be attentive to as someone that was living in San Francisco and a social worker. So we really do need to think about paths of accessibility that are sustainable, and also training and education that continues to reflect on anti-racism work and anti-oppression work. And so, I hope that in the future, the psychedelic education looks a lot different than the education that I received. Really, much more reflecting on the needs of the communities I've served and will like to continue to serve. Right? What are the models for folks who live in poverty? How are they going to access 8 hours of MDMA therapy? And what kind of programs that are going to be, more of like a wraparound, and how is that going to be funded? And so, right now, it just feels like, you know, of course, like the research has shown, it's mostly like white folks and of a certain income. And so that's kind of where my head spins. And I'm hoping that in the future, there is more conversation and ideas, so that not only do we have trained clinicians and education that reflects our communities, but that there are models to help our community members that have different needs.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing up the accessibility piece. I appreciate that. I am so grateful for all the contributions you both have given on these topics, and I would love for, like you said, if what needs to happen is greater education and education on anti-racism and all these things. If both of you would just like to share some of your favorite resources or resources that you'd recommend that listeners check out to help educate themselves, Ifetayo, will go with you first.
Sure. Yeah. So,
And also mention your own organizations.
yes, yes. So POC Psychedelic Collective, we're active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our website's www.poccpsychedelics.com. So there you can see a lot of our past work, other organizations or resources out there. I would definitely recommend my former organization, the Drug Policy Alliance. They have a wealth of information on their website around not only psychedelics, but all substances. They have harm reduction information, also policy information. Um, of course, MAPS has a lot of good information. I'll also, Harm Reduction Coalition, Dance Safe, and I'll also say Dr. Carl Hart. He, I had the chance of meeting him a few times, and also read his first book, and I'm grateful that I came into learning about his work at the time that I did. It changed my perspective on a lot of things, especially around addiction. And, I like that he keeps it really simple, even though he's an academic, he keeps it really simple in his book. And he, basically is saying that, like, hey, like, people don't get addicted to drugs just because they love how it tastes, like it's ice cream. There's something deeper than there's more complicated. And we need to stop punishing people for addiction, basically. So those are my resources.
Excellent. And I'm so glad you threw in Dr. Carl Hart. He single-handedly turned me on to psychedelic exceptionalism. And that one
Mhm,
concept is like, oh, that has really informed everything I've done since then. This is,
mhm,
he's so powerful in, like you said, getting that concept across just in a way that really hits you. I mean, like you
yeah.
understand it right when he says it. You're like, oh, wow, I've been thinking about this the wrong way, and in a way that's actually going to do harm. And so let's rethink
Mhm,
that whole paradigm.
mhm.
So thank you for those recommendations. Mary, your turn.
Yeah, so Ify already mentioned the Harm Reduction Coalition, but if you, our dear friends Francis Fu and Charles Hawthorne, we did an event where we talked a lot about that, some of Carl Hart's work and psychedelic exceptionalism, and just really reflecting on our own judgments and biases and where did they come from, when did we first feel that in our bodies. And so and that's available on our website. I just for myself was also just so blown away by their knowledge and just the way that they presented all of this beautiful information. Let's see, also sensible drug policy, they have a lot of really great information. um, who else? I follow Darren Springer out of the UK just because it's so nice to hear a black, another black perspective. I believe is it called the Kind Network for Kalingi's network. Some of his work that's still
Oh,
accessible, I believe.
oh yeah,
But of
yeah.
course, he has so much information that I still look up on YouTube. Um, so those are just a few others, and I'm always, exploring other kind of getting to know different people in the community, and I'm really excited to see how people are right now building more spaces for psychedelics for people of color. And I think that was kind of one of the very sweet gifts of being part of POC Psychedelic Collective is really starting to build more community. And I know for myself, that's just been so nourishing since being in such white dominated spaces. And so now I'm like, okay, unless I really need to go to that space, I will continue to be fed and supported and loved and cared for in my BIPOC community spaces.
Beautiful. And did you want to share your own practice as well?
Sure, yeah. You can find me Impact Center. So right now I just do in Oakland. I'm just doing telehealth at this point, but I am doing some ketamine training at the end of this month, and so that might be something I do in the future. My dear friend Courtney, Doorway Therapeutics, she's doing. She focuses on Two Spirit, LGBTQ, BIPOC folks here in Oakland, and they're just an incredible organization as well. And so they've started some ketamine work. So, yeah, stop by my website. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. I truly appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us and all the listeners. And I wish you both the best of luck in each of your personal endeavors.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks for having
Thank you.
us.
Absolutely. And for everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Plant Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us an iTunes rating or review. It helps other people find the show. And if you'd like to find out more about plant medicine, including the show notes from today's episode, please head over to plantmedicine.org. The music for the Plant Medicine Podcast is by the incredible Porangi. If you'd like to check out his music, please find him at porangi.com or on social media at PORANGUI.